So I would like first to thank the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii for organizing this great event. It's quite a difficult time, and we are really grateful for their efficient work, you know, and for making this possible. So the last session was great, but now we have even a greater session with three great persons, I would say. So we have Ronald Lee, David McCarthy, and Andrew Mason that are going to present a paper. It would be nice if you could stick to 10, 12 minutes at maximum, you know, and then we will have two discussants, Miguel Sanchez Romero and me, actually. And then a general discussion, you know. So it's a 1 hour. So we finish at 7:30 sharp, I would say. So Ron, you will be the first. So if you want to share your screen, it would be great. And start.
So these things, in turn, labor, assets, affect productivity, wages, interest rates, consumption, and income. So we use NTA profiles to explain the relation of population age distribution outcomes. I'm going to be focusing particularly on consumption per effective consumer as the outcome of interest here. And I'm going to contrast the outcomes according to 3 different measures of the economic effect of the age distribution change. First, we have our workforce in NTA, the support ratio, which measures the dependence of consumers on labor income of others. But of course, we know many people use asset income in addition to transfers to fund their consumption. So we can broaden this approach. And the next measure is what I'm now calling the Open Impact Index, OII. I used to call General Support Ratio. And this includes asset income by age. And it takes wages and interest rates as given. And so it's appropriate for a smallish open economy. And then the third is Closed Impact Index, or CII, which takes wages and interest rates as endogenous and depending on the amount of capital relative to labor in the closed economy. And then if there's more capital per worker, it raises wages and reduces interest rates. So we'll look at these 3 different measures based on different assumptions. And I'm going to focus particularly on the closed economy model. And this uses this simple Cobb-Douglas production function to drive that. And now I'm moving on to the next, which is to simulate changes in the capital labor ratio and also at the same time wages to interest rate ratio for different countries and regions. And this is showing the changes relative to 2015. So you see for Europe and the US that over the course of the century, there would be modest but important changes in the capital labor ratio. It would rise by 20 to 40% across the 21st century. We then look at Latin America and see much bigger changes from 60% to more than doubling. I think this is, well, it reflects various things, but I think mostly it's reflecting just stage in the demographic dividend and demographic transition and how much aging is in the future. And then for Asia, we see in between. There'll be more substantial changes except for a couple of countries. So the rising capital labor ratio then goes with rising ratio of wages to interest rates. Now let's look at the outcome measure of consumption per consumer. Okay. So first let's contrast Sweden and the US. Sweden and the US have very similar declines in their support ratio as their population ages. But in Sweden, which relies much more heavily on public transfers and has lower saving and fewer, well, maybe not lower saving now, and has fewer assets, there's little capital intensification, and the population aging is much more costly. In the US, which relies about the elderly rely about 2/3 on asset income in the US, we see that both by the open and closed economy measures, most of the decline in the support ratio is offset by capital intensification, and then we would also see rising wages relative to interest rates. Okay, now to take another example, we look at a developing country, and Mexico is in its dividend phase. So this SR, the blue line, is the support ratio. We see it's still rising, and there'll be another 35 years or something of demographic dividend. But that rising labor force also leads to capital dilution. And so in a closed economy, there's going to be a reduction in the capital labor ratio, and most of the support ratio gains are going to be offset by declining labor productivity. On the other hand, in an open economy, in this gray line here, foreign capital is going to flow in, keep the capital labor ratio higher, and you have a larger and more protracted demographic dividend. And of course, there are many other issues with foreign investment, but I'm not going to talk about this here. Okay, now let's ask, how would higher fertility or lower fertility relative to the median UN total fertility rate projection impact each of these measures? Okay, so we can just use the UN high and low fertility projections to do our simulations here. And so we'll look at this ratio of outcomes to the median variant for a few different cases for support ratio, open economy, and closed economy. So here is Germany, which is fairly typical of all the developed countries, rich industrial countries I've looked at. And so what we're looking at is to remind you is, let's focus on the dotted lines. That is the effect if we followed the low fertility UN projection trajectory, which is at half of a birth lower. And what we see is that for Germany, lower fertility is going to increase, we're looking at the blue dotted line here, it's going to increase the support ratio for about 40 years. Why is that? Well, fewer kids to support for the most part. But then after that, there's a decrease in the support ratio as the population aging implications work their way through. But if we now look at the closed economy index with green arrow points, this orange dotted line, we see that almost all of that deterioration in the support ratio will be offset by the benefits of capital intensification. So it looks like even for a rich industrial country like Germany with already low fertility, if you take this model literally, it's saying probably Germany would be better off with even substantially lower fertility in the past. And that would be true for most really low fertility countries. And then the open economy index is somewhere in between these two. Okay, well, that's kind of, do we really believe that? I don't want to push that too hard, but that's where this analysis goes. And then Mexico, which is quite typical of developing countries, we can ask what would happen if it had even a half child lower than the UN projection. Well, again, the blue line is showing that the demographic dividend is enhanced. It would be even greater. It would last longer. And, but eventually it would lead to more population aging than otherwise and a decline in the support ratio. But once again, if we take into account capital intensification, then it's better in the long run as well as the medium run. So let me just conclude now. And I have a little grace period because of my technical difficulties, but I only need another minute. If we take capital into account, then the demographic dividend, including something like a dividend for population aging, looks bigger, lasts longer, and population aging is less costly. So we find lower fertility would raise consumption in all countries we look at, including low fertility, high income countries for at least 40 years. Lower fertility would raise capital intensity in all countries, offsetting rising old age dependency. Wages will rise, relative interest rates, and then in some countries, I didn't show this, but in a fair number of countries, lower versus higher fertility makes very little long-run difference. So these results, in a way, they're echoing the kinds of things we found in the 2014 science paper, the group NTA publication. If you incorporate capital, it really, low fertility is not so bad unless you get very low levels. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ron. So indeed, the inclusion of this capital deepening effect, within the NTA and the projection made with the NTA is indeed very important. So we move directly to the second presentation, which is also about, capital accounts or wealth accounts, if you wish, with David McCarthy. David, if you want to share your screen.
This paper is called Intergenerational Dark Matter, and what we look at is the importance of inter vivos capital transfers in determining the wealth distribution of the UK. Now, it's still very much a work in progress, but the basic idea is that we are using historical data on the wealth distribution of the UK. And when I say wealth distribution here, what I mean is the wealth distribution by age. And we use a lot of assumptions to estimate the importance of inter vivos capital transfers in determining on how that age distribution of wealth in the UK is going to change. So what we do is we project the wealth distribution of the UK forward. So we know what the wealth distribution of the UK was starting around 2005. We also have some idea of what bequest flows are, some idea of inter vivos flows, and then all the other NTA profiles. And then we show that the wealth distribution will become increasingly skewed towards the elderly, even after we account for significant undercounting of inter vivos transfers in the survey data. So, and what we're planning to do is we're planning to project backwards and compare our projected backwards, so historically extrapolated, I guess projected is the wrong word, wealth distributions with the actual wealth distributions from past data that we are busy reconstructing. And we believe that the historical development of the wealth distribution of the UK cannot be replicated unless inter vivos transfers or capital transfers are of the same order of bequests and much higher than reported in surveys. And there are two previous works by Karajanaki and Anthony Atkinson that find similar underreporting in surveys. And really our paper replicates, we think, or will replicate, we think, the findings of Wolf in 1999 in a paper of the Geneva proceedings, I think, for the US. So what I'll do is I'll go through a little bit of theory. There are going to be lots of equations here, but please don't be too hung up by the equations. I think the ideas are pretty simple. And then we'll take the equations to the data and illustrate some preliminary results. So the first part of the theory is looking at bequests. So what we assume is that we have an age profile of the proportion of couples cohabiting, and that is constant over time, but it varies by age, and that's chi. We assume that household financial wealth is comprised of three categories. We have housing, we have financial assets, less financial liabilities, and pensions. And again, that breakdown is assumed to be constant over time, but it varies by age. For when someone dies, if they are cohabiting, then what we do is we divide the bequest at death between the spouse, who is assumed to be the same cohort, and the next generation. Housing and pension wealth are bequeathed to the spouse without probate, and financial assets go to the next generation through probate. So I don't know how inheritance works in other countries. In the UK, what happens is that there's a court of probate that allocates assets in the case of death, and that process of the allocation of these assets is called probate. Now, when you die as a married couple, many of your assets do not go through probate. So, for instance, pension wealth and housing wealth, provided the house is jointly owned by the couple, those are never seen by the probate system. They just transfer automatically to the spouse. Financial assets, on the other hand, will go through probate, and we assume those go to the next generation. If a single person dies, then we assume that the entire bequest, other than pension wealth, goes to the next generation through probate. You may say, well, what about pension wealth? Well, here we're implicitly making the assumption that all pension wealth is either in the form of defined benefit pensions or it's been annuitized. So if you had a defined contribution pension, you bought an annuity with that pension. And what that means is that when you die, the value of your pension goes to zero because you're dead. But the value of everybody else who survived, the value of their pensions goes up by a little bit. And basically, your capital is being redistributed to other members of your cohort. And that's why we've excluded pension wealth. So if you want to sort of calculate what a theoretical formula for what a probated estate would look like, then we've got this formula over here. We've got the mortality probability multiplied by the financial wealth for cohabitors and the non-pension wealth for singles multiplied by the total amount of assets. And what we've done is we have performed that calculation on 2015 data and then compared it to probate data from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is the UK's IRS. And there you can see that that process fits the probate data pretty well. So on the top, what I've presented there is the aggregate amount of probated bequests by age. So that's an aggregate amount, and you can see there's a slight peak here relative to our work. And the dotted line is what we calculate using that formula. The solid line is the actual data. And per capita, we match very, very, very closely, except there's a slight increase. We slightly underestimate bequests at these ages. But it's not a bad fit, right? The next part of the theory is capital transfers given. So here what we do is we've got bequests plus inter vivos transfers. So the total amount of bequests given is that, right? Which is just the total wealth multiplied by the mortality probability. And then the inter vivos transfers, we have some assumed profile of inter vivos transfers, and we simply scale the profile to match transfers received. So what we do is we say, well, we've got transfers given and transfers received. People are more likely to report that they've received a transfer than that they've given one. And so therefore we balance to transfers received. And that's just a balancing coefficient to ensure that the profiles match up and that the sum is zero. In terms of capital transfers received, what we have is we have bequests to the same cohort, plus bequests to different cohorts, plus inter vivos capital transfers received. So here's again the mortality probability. These are the bequests given to the same cohort. These are the bequests given to different cohorts, and those are the inter vivos transfers received. So there's again this implicit assumption that all pension wealth is either DB wealth or annuity wealth. So bequests in that case are automatically passed to other members of the same cohort in the form of mortality credits. And then what we do is we go to the data and we examine age profiles of inheritances and capital transfers received. And this allows us to scale these different heights. And so what we've got is the solid line is in our wealth and asset survey. This is what people reported receiving in terms of capital transfers. And you can see that the receivers are generally quite young. And these are the bequest profiles that people report receiving. So those give us an idea of the shapes of those profiles. In terms of the theory about the changes in the distribution of wealth, so this is really just a sort of a version of the NTA flow equation that's slightly adjusted to include capital transfers. And basically it means that changes in wealth over time are fully accounted for by labor income, consumption, public and private transfers, capital transfers, and revaluations due to changes in prices. And so that's the revaluation. So it's really a growth factor. And it's, the growth could come in the form of asset income, or it could come in the form of changes in prices. And then we have initial and terminal conditions. And the initial condition is that cohorts are born with nothing. And the terminal condition is that they die with nothing once you take into account the net capital transfer that they give at death. And then in principle, given the shapes of those profiles and this adjustment equation, we can use that to project forwards and backwards from a given baseline year using NTA profiles for these items and these capital transfer profiles that I've just shown you. So what are our data sources for the UK? Now, the UK does not have, generally speaking, wealth taxes. So our wealth data is highly incomplete. And unfortunately, the further back we go, the more incomplete it becomes. Pension wealth in particular is a big problem. And pension wealth is large in magnitude because the UK, like the US, relies on a funded pension system where people accumulate assets in order to sustain their consumption in old age. So in terms of wealth, we have the Wealth and Asset Survey from 2006. That is complete. So it has all the sources of wealth. We have the British Household Panel Survey in those years, which is complete except pension wealth. We have the Family Resource Survey, which goes back to 93. We have housing, some financial assets, mortgages, no other financial liabilities or pension wealth. And the General Household Survey, which has flows of pension contributions and flows of pension benefits, but no other estimates of wealth. In terms of bequests, we have the Wealth and Asset Survey again. We have the Inland Revenue Probate Records going back to 1980, and we have the British Household Panel Survey from 1990 onwards. And inter vivos transfers, we have the Wealth and Asset Survey from 2006 and the British Household Panel Survey from 1990. So in the future, when this work is complete, we will use backward and forward projections to try and fill the gaps, calibrating the parameters to fit the observed data as described. But for now, all we've done is we have projected the wealth distribution forward. So what we do is we start in 2015, and then we project the wealth distribution forward by age, okay? And if we use inter vivos transfers as reported in the survey, and we project the wealth distribution forward, you can see there are two major patterns. The first major pattern is that, so here that's 1 year forward, 10 years forward, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and 50 years forward. And what we have is that there are two major things going on. The first is that the peak of the wealth distribution is getting older and older and older, right? And the second thing that's going on is the young have increasingly less wealth. So the outcome of this is that a greater and greater and greater share of the wealth of the UK is going to be held by the elderly. Because our private sector is not in balance, what's going to happen is if you project forward far enough, we're eventually going to run out of wealth. So what we do is we calculate separate profiles based on rebalancing, and that's what that is after 50 years. Now, some of this delay in the accumulation of wealth by the young is due to older labor market entry. And this is sort of something that came up in the previous session about the age period cohort models, I think that Ron mentioned, is that if you use the APC models and you find out that 22-year-olds born in 1980 have a much lower wage income than 22-year-olds born in 1950, and from that you infer that they're doing worse. One thing you may have overlooked is the big change in the labor market participation of people of those ages in the different cohorts, because there's been a tremendous expansion in the UK, and I'm sure in other rich countries, about the proportion of people that undertake higher education, and that has caused a delay in labor market entry. And so therefore, it's not obvious that, if you do find a big cohort effect associated with labor income at that age, that it's due to necessarily the young being worse off. It may actually be that the young are getting a better education and therefore might actually be better off in the long run. So what we do then is we say, okay, but we know these inter vivos capital transfers are underreported. So what we do is we scale them up, and we say, other people have said they think they're equal to bequests. So what happens if we set these equal to bequests? Well, what we see is that the young aren't quite as worse off, which is what we would have expected, because they're getting greater transfers than they did before. But we still have this pattern of an ever increasing the age of peak asset holdings rises, not quite as fast, but it still rises, and as a consequence, again, the proportion of assets in the UK held by the elderly rises or will rise over time. And unfortunately, that's all I've got to show you. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this methodology, work it backwards, calibrating to the observed wealth distributions that we have at these various points in time, and then infer from that the extent of likely undercounting in the inter vivos transfers. So clearly much work remains. The pension wealth in particular is a big problem. So what we're doing at the moment is using an inventory method. So we have pension wealth distribution at a certain age. We've got flows of benefits paid and contributions made again by age, and we're going to try and use an inventory method. Unfortunately, the legal definition of a defined benefit pension plan is a pension plan for which you cannot use the inventory method. We're still investigating whether we can find alternatives. But it seems likely to us that for the wealth distribution to remain stable, inter vivos capital transfers downwards will need to be much higher than recorded, and possibly even higher than bequest flows. So I will end it there, and I hope I haven't exceeded my allotted time.
Thank you very much, David. It's really impressive, and I wish we could replicate, those findings for the other NTA countries. It's really nice and very interesting. Our next speaker is Andrew Mason from the University of Hawaii. Andrew, could you share your screen? Very good. So the floor is yours.
So this is a very simple exercise as compared with everything else we've talked about this morning, or we'll probably talk about in the entire conference. But I wanted to use this to talk about a very simple issue, the costs of funding transfers for old age programs versus the cost of relying on a funded approach. And I'm going to, this is a simple model, but it can be applied easily to 186 economies. So we've done that using the NTA indicators data. And there's nothing surprising about these results, the qualitative nature of them, that if you rely on a funded system for old age needs, for an extended period of time, the cost will be much higher because you have to you're pre-funding the pension system as compared with the transfer system where you just pay as you go along. But after some time, the cost of the funded program declines while the cost of a transfer program becomes very high and would reach unsustainable levels. So the cost of the transfer program is very straightforward. That's just the life cycle deficit at old ages, people 65 and older, I think we use as a share of labor income. So this is, you know, if you were, this is to say, well, suppose we taxed labor income and we use that to fund all old age needs, how high would the tax have to be? And so that's all we're doing with that. So what about the funded system? Well, we just rely on the simple identity that's well known that shows the relationship between saving and wealth. So where wealth is the ratio between wealth and labor income. So the saving rate is equal to the rate of growth of labor income times the ratio of wealth to labor income plus the change in the ratio of wealth to labor income. So in steady state, that final term would drop out. But during a transition, which is of course very important to what we're going through now, actually the DW is a very important factor. So the calculations we've done here, this is where the simple part goes in. We're assuming that the rate of growth of effective labor is as we calculate using our projections. These are UN population projections, plus 1.5% productivity growth. And then wealth is calculated in the way that we always do in NTA work. So it's the present value of the prospective life cycle deficit of all those in the pre-retirement and retirement phases of the life cycle. So this shows the determinants of saving. This is the growth in labor income for the 186 economies, which have been aggregated up into 4 income groups. And so the growth was about the same at 4% per year in 19. What is this? I can't see it from, let me move my little thing. Okay. So in 1975, 80. But now the growth has declined in high income countries because of their early transition through the demographic transition. And then this shows in the bottom panel the change in wealth relative to labor income. So it grows from around 4 in 1970, and today it's around 8 in high income countries, ranging down to 1 in low income countries. So that's the basic input data. And now we can compare the transfer versus the funded system. So let's look at the transfer system first, and you can see that, well, the life cycle deficit relative to labor income grows very sharply in all these simulations, of course. This is what we worry about. And the old age gap as a percent of labor income is projected to reach 55% of labor income in high income countries by 2100. So successively lower in lower income countries. And then this looks at what's the saving that's required to fund a funded pension system. And so it rises very sharply, much earlier than the transfer costs rise. But it peaks, and it's peaking about now in high income countries. Note that it is higher still than the old age transfer system, but the decline is about to come, and we'll reach much lower levels in the future. And So this would be sustainable. So I'm talking about this as though this is actually what's happening, but it's not what's happening. Nobody has a fully funded system. And people have some combination of these two. And but these are the polar options. So I think the key findings are that the impact of aging on transfer systems is low in the early stages. They've now peaked in high income countries and are near the peak in upper middle income countries. The cost of a funded approach occurs early. They're much higher than under the transfer system. The costs of the transfer system are very high and surely unsustainable in the later stages of aging. But early on, it's a lot cheaper way to go. And so that may be one of the reasons that countries are so inclined to adopt this approach, even though it isn't sustainable in the future. So this is, one could think about extensions to this kind of approach, or I don't know, these calculations could be done using any of the models I think that people are talking about now. It's just something that I don't think they calculate or compare. So this could certainly be done with Ron's simulations that he presented this morning, if he considered these two polar cases or some combination of those. So it would be easy to adopt this simulation to a hybrid system, which is kind of what we've done in the past. We've said, well, suppose that the old age needs are funded half by transfers and half by assets, or a third by transfers and 2/3 by assets. Well, this thing is, you could just wait and add them up and you would get the same results. But you have to understand that that's assuming that you've gone along this approach the entire time. And so if there's reform, you have to, that entails a much greater cost. If you if you switch from a transfer system to a funded system, then you have to raise saving much more in order to accumulate the assets that were not accumulated in the past. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. You know, it's very nice to see that we could use those NTA data to address a very important and political issue. We are not only doing some descriptive statistics, but we are also able to address a topical debate of the moment. So the first discussant will be Miguel Sanchez Romero from the Technical University of Vienna.
So first of all, thank you to the East West Center, and thank you, Pauline, for letting me discuss these three amazing papers. I will start discussing the paper of Andy, and I will follow with the paper of Ron, and finally with the paper of David McCarthy. Now, what I have to say with the paper of Andy is not as simple as he's presenting. So there are many more concepts, and all the concepts are very tight within the three papers. So actually what Andy is trying to do, and he has clearly said, that is how to finance all age wealth demand. And in order to do that, he has used what is the well-known identity that David McCarthy has already presented, that is the life cycle wealth has to be equal to the wealth plus transfer wealth. So what actually Andy has done is analyzing two polar cases. The first polar case is one in which he's assuming that the transfer wealth is equal to 0, and then all the life cycle wealth that the elderly are demanding will be financed by capital, by wealth, in terms of David's notation. And the other polar cases is in which the wealth is equal to 0 And then the transfer wealth has to be equal to the life cycle wealth. Now, in order to fully understand what is going on here, we need to go back to what Davis was presenting, and it's actually that the life cycle wealth has to be calculated as the sum of the elderly population age distribution times the present value at each age of the remaining life cycle deficits. So once that we are understanding that this is the kind of calculation that Andy is doing all the time, then what we understand directly is that we need to obtain capital, and capital, how is capital built up, is through savings. So he's calculating on one side the savings that are necessary in order to reach that level of capital. And on the other hand, we have transfer wealth. Now, how transfer wealth is built up, in this particular case, is the transfers that the current workers are doing to the current retirees or the current elderly. And the proxy is the old age support. So in this particular case, what I have to say is that how he is deriving the dynamics of the case is excellent. So it's very theoretically grounded. So it's within NTA and everything is correct. But I have doubts because I'm not so sure whether he is satisfying the equality that the transfer wealth has to be equal to the life cycle wealth at all times. So this is the only thing, the only doubt that I have with respect to the model. Now, the other issue is that in order to calculate the life cycle wealth, we need to calculate the present value, and the present value needs a discount factor. And when we are analyzing these two cases, these two polar cases, I have real doubts that the discount factor will stay constant all the time. So if it's transfer, we know that we are in the Samuelson model. So it is the growth rate of the population plus the productivity. So that's the discount factor. If we are in the capital, we have to calculate it. So it is not as simple in principle. And we also know that in these calculations, Andy is missing what David McCarthy and James Sefton, they have already presented, that is the part of the bequests. So this is not included because it's not in the standard NTA profiles. And one of the things that I find interesting / striking is that when Andy has shown the evolution of the life cycle wealth, one of the things that struck me was that there was more than 40 years gap in the life cycle wealth relative to the labor income between the high income countries and the upper middle countries, and even more than 100 between the high income countries and the middle and low income countries. So I will need an explanation on this, some debate on this. Now, regarding Ron's paper, Ron has tried to analyze what is the effect of a change in the age structure of the population and the macroeconomy. In this case, Ron is taking into account what will be the effect of changes in the capital to labor ratio, that this has an impact on the changes in the input prices, so interest rate and wages. So in this case, Ron does not have this particular problem, but I have a slight doubts. I mean, it's not doubt, I think that what he's doing with the perturbation in the population age structure, he's having like a totum revolutum of the different demographic factors. So everything, so the fertility change, the mortality change, and the migration change, everything is embedded in these perturbance that is introducing in the population. It's super interesting, but at the same time, I think that this is country specific and is not the same perturbation for all countries. So if that is the case, that Ron can correct me, then I think that it will be much more convenient to have the same perturbation for all the countries. I will move quickly to the close-open economy. And what I think that is important in this case is that we continue the debate of what is the impact of the fertility fund. So in my case, I fully agree that there will be a capital abundance in these economies, but I I have the feeling that something is missing in our models, in our economic models. I truly believe that there will be a lack of labor supply and an investment like is happening most of the time in other countries, for instance, in Japan. So I'm pretty much in line with what Professor Hayashida talked yesterday in this particular case. And regarding David McCarthy presentation, what they are doing is the reconstruction of the UK wealth. Now we know that this is super important, so bequests is an important component that we need to introduce, all of us. We know, for instance, as we have seen in the presentation of Andy, that if we don't have this into account, maybe we have some bias, and at the same time, it will influence on the savings profile. So it's really important to take into account bequests. Now, what David McCarthy was presenting was using the standard the wealth balancing equation that can be used either backward or forward. And in this particular case, so this is the formula, is slightly changed, but I can comment later on. What is really interesting in the plots that he was showing is that I have found striking these sizable inheritance transfers among members of the same cohort, and the very small inheritance that is passed to the next generation. So I don't know whether there is an issue there, whether you are not taking into account the number of heirs. I really doubt that you are making an error here. So maybe my suggestion is that you will split up in the profile of the inheritance received, those that they are coming from the parents, so from the previous generation, and those that are being received from the current generation, in order to really disentangle which ones, so from who you are receiving this money. And some questions / wishes that I would like to see is that I think, and it was partly answered in the previous presentation, in the previous session, to show how post-mortem and inter vivos capital transfer will change with the before and after the Great Recession, and this can be used for dealing with the projection, the forward projection of the effect of the COVID-19 in the inter vivos capital transfers. So I can pass this, and thank you for your attention.
Very nice paper. So I'm going to make some short comment. This will be, let's say, some minor comment for major paper. So let me start with the paper by Ron. So it's a computation of the impact of the demography, holding behavior that we name in the NTA community profile constant. And the first question that I have is that it would be nice to compare, those results with, let's say, the macro empirical literature, on the effect of demographic change. And because we are indeed using a very nice framework. I really like the math as a model of Ron, but it would be nice to be able to compare to what has been said, already with different methods. And I will start with first, let's say, unfair question. So we know that profiles that we are using are cross-sectional, and we also know that they might be different from life cycle one. So I would wonder how we could handle this issue, in particular that basically saving by age, are computed here and are very important. So I feel that it's an important step to address. I feel that basically I see the model as let's say a solo model with age distribution. So I feel that it could be interesting and easy to extend it, to compute the dynamic effect and to evaluate the short run effect basically of population change. Especially because might be that behavior or profile are less susceptible to change, in the short run. I have a curiosity that I don't know how to interpret the fact that there is no exogenous or endogenous growth in the model. And so there are some literature on the impact of change in the demography on, let's say, technology adoption, etc. And so I feel that it could be an issue. And the last small question will be, not so sure that the distinction between closed or open economy is so helpful. I would say that I believe that we belong in an open economy, but in those economies, factor price are not constant actually. So and demographic factors, think about the debate on immigration and wage, for instance. So we are in an open economy with immigration that modifies the wage of the natives. So it's an important issue. Concerning the paper by David and James, so it's a theory-based computation. So it's very nice. Huh? I feel that this was suggested by Miguel, but I'm not so sure that in this setting that the lifetime is uncertain actually. I feel that it's a theory as if people had a deterministic lifetime, even if it could be heterogeneous, and we see it in the equation. So basically, what you call a probability is basically a difference in the size of the population, of the core population. So it also includes migration. So it's not so clear to me what is the true relevant theoretical background, of this model. And related to that, I would say that the treatment of annuitized wealth, financial wealth, is important and not so clear. I'm not so sure that I understand how you distinguish like those very particular assets like annuity or life insurance. And finally, I would say that it would be great to evaluate, to use this framework to evaluate the effect of some specific demographic change, like the drop in fertility, of course, but also the reduction in the age difference between spouse. You assume that spouse have the same age, but it's not true, and especially that across cohorts there is an important change, a reduction in the age difference between spouse, and I guess that basically it was also an intergenerational transfer, or at least an inter-cohort transfer. And for the paper of Andy, which is also very nice. So there is the first issue that that you name basically a cost, the fact that you should save. So I feel that for the funding system. So I feel this is really like a Keynesian approach, that saving is not a good thing, in the economy, whereas, some people may think differently. And in that respect, I'm not so sure I've understood that why it should, at least for the most industrialized country, why it should decrease, from 2020. Second, I have also a question, about what is the cost of a funded system in a global economy where saving is internationally mobile. So I have the impression that you compute the domestic saving, but which is only part of the of the saving that could be used to fund your firms. And some suggestion, I think it would be nice to first group the country according to the dominant system, transfer or funded, and to try to visualize whether you could reproduce with your model some let's say some historical trend. Are you able to replicate the past? It will be a great great importance. So let me stop here. I suggest that we'll leave a couple of minutes to all the presenters to answer. So this will be first round, and then David, and then Andrew, and then we'll finish the session, by asking, the participant if they have some question. Do not hesitate to send your question by the message system if you wish. So Ron, it's for you.
Okay, thank for these very careful, thoughtful, very helpful comments. Let me just respond to two. The first on Miguel, probably the least interesting comment he made, but the only one I really captured was whether the perturbations to the population were the same for every country. No, they were based on the UN projection. So they're all depending on the demography of each country individually. I think Miguel probably was saying something about strong assumptions of substitution of capital for labor when the labor force declines, but I'm not sure if that's what he was saying. I certainly agree that's a strong assumption. Now, for Hippolyte, yes, these are cross-sectional profiles. Are they going to stay? Is that appropriate? Well, a cross-sectional profile for cross-sectional simulations maybe isn't the worst thing. But for some countries, for example, the East Asian countries with the fantastically rapid economic growth in the past, it's clear cross-sectional profiles, they're not going to stay the same shape in the future because we have income peaking in the 20s and asset income greatest in the 20s and early 30s. That's because of the phenomenally rapid growth and how wealthy the young are relative to the old. And as soon as growth slows down, as it will, they're going to look more like the others. So I've mostly excluded. I don't include China in this because of that worry. But that's not a complete solution. I'm not sure what a complete solution would be. I think one possible approach would be to try to use the history of productivity growth in each country to sort of de-trend the cross-sectional life cycle and turn it into something that then you would reimpose whatever productivity growth in the future you made on top of it. But I'm probably not going to do that. Anyway, thank you very much. I need to digest these comments.
Thank you, Miguel and Hippolyte, for those really interesting comments. I'm only going to comment on a few of them. So, Miguel, the way that we dealt with the number of beneficiaries of an estate was by using the profile of benefits received. So, if there are systematic changes in the gap between the ages of the beneficiaries, then that profile won't remain constant. It will, if the age gap is narrowing, it will peak more, and if the age gap is widening, it will spread out more. So that's where we get the number of beneficiaries and the age spread of the beneficiaries from. We don't assume it theoretically. And Hippolyte, thanks for your really valuable comments. In terms of migration, you're absolutely right about that. That is a population change. So, we take a very Brexit approach here, and that is that if you leave the country, you die, okay? So, but that is important, and it's something we'll have to think about. We've had tremendous difficulties with life insurance. The issue with life insurance is there are so many different types of life insurance products, and all of them are different, and they're not well recorded in the national accounts. So, so it's been very, very, very difficult even to separate something as simple as a defined benefit pension plan versus a defined contribution pension plan. To get the macro controls from the national accounts has been impossible, and so we've basically had to give up on that, and to try and distinguish between different kinds of life insurance within the national accounts it's a hopeless task. And also the consumption survey, the asset surveys are also pretty vague about, if you have a life insurance policy, well, what kind of life insurance policy is it? We don't know. In terms of the annuities, it's the reason that we didn't worry about bequests of annuitized wealth is because if you look at the increase in an annuity price from one age to the next, it increases for two reasons. One is because there's a mortality credit that's associated with the fact that if you survive to the next age, you haven't died. And so what the annuity does is it pools all of the longevity risk associated with a particular group of people and basically redistributes the capital of those people who die early to those people who live for a long time. And so in our framework, if you provided that you value the annuities consistently at each age, which is what we've done, taking into account conditional survival, then all the equations balance 100%. So we're not too worried about that one. And you know, your point about the reduction in the age gap of spouses is again, you know, really important. I think we've in the cohorts where the bequests are most common, you know, we've assumed the spouse is the same age. I think we're probably wrong on that. I think you're absolutely right that the spouse is probably a bit younger, and maybe if the spouse is a female, and men typically, as we know, die first. So, you know, the spouse in that case would probably be a bit younger, and that's something we should think about changing. And there probably have been reductions in that age gap. But thank you very much for your comments. I think they're really valuable.
Thank you, David. Andrew?
Yeah. Well, let me quickly go through these. Let's see, I think I understand why Miguel is concerned that under the transfer case, that transfer wealth doesn't equal life cycle wealth. And actually, I think that's true by definition. We can talk about it sometime, but it doesn't really play into the calculations I'm doing anyway. I don't calculate transfer wealth. I don't need it to calculate the cost of a transfer system. I'm just looking at the transfers directly. Why does, let me move to Hippolyte's point about why does the saving rate decline when we use the funded system? Well, one of the purposes of saving is to maintain the capital output ratio to keep it at pace with the rate of growth of labor income. That's the GW term. The second purpose of saving is to adjust the ratio of wealth to labor income to keep pace with the fact that aging is increasing. Okay, so it's the increase in aging that's driving that. And the big increases in aging are coming over the next 15 or 20 years in high income countries. After that, the pace of aging is slowing. And so we don't have to raise the capital, the ratio of wealth to labor income as much as we have in the past. And so the saving rate can decline. Now, interest rates. Well, yeah, I worry about interest rates all the time. You know, what's going to happen to interest rates? And I'm sure that I think differently about it being an American than if I lived in Mali. So, and I'm sure people disagree with the way I think about interest rates. I keep thinking they're going to go down, but how could they even go down further than they already are in the United States? So, and Gretchen's talking about modern monetary theory, and I look at that. So I don't know what to say about interest rates, except, boy, it sure matters a lot. And man, if you have a good model for that, bless you, that's terrific. Okay, so the global economy. So one of the things that thoughts I've had is that, you know, not incorporating capital into this model is a huge simplification of it, of course. And that really matters a lot when we talk about a closed economy or something more like the United States. But most countries they're part of the open economy. And so interest rates shouldn't matter really for those economies on what they do about pension old age needs, that's going to be determined in the international markets. At the same time, the whole world is aging. And so internationally, are interest rates going to go down, and how is that going to affect Mali? A very interesting question. Replicability, yeah, that would be great. In a way, we've done that. So in the past, we've taken very similar models, and some of my earliest work was taking very similar models and using that to estimate how saving rates are affected by changes in age structure. And most recently, Tomoko Kinagasa and I did a paper in Rural Development in which we looked at these kinds of models and how that affected saving rates. And they are pretty good at estimating saving rates in some parts of the world, and they're not very good at all when it comes to parts of the world where transfer systems are very important.
Thank you very much, Andy. So we are already 15 minutes late, so there's a high risk that I become the worst chairman of the whole conference. But if there is a few more questions, you know, I would be, please do it now. Ask now. Yes, Ivan.
Yes, hi, I have a question for Ron. His model is very interesting, but I know he doesn't consider inequality and in his model, but that might have some important impact in the projections. And also that might influence these differences between open and closed assumptions of the economy. For example, in Mexico, we opened the economy with the NAFTA in 1994, and there was a decrease in employment in the formal employment rather than the opposite. And also foreign investment, it's always welcome, but I don't think that has some redistributed effects, and eventually the operating surplus goes back to the stakeholders in these foreign countries. So I'm not sure how that might play in the projection, but great work.
Ron, you want to quickly answer?
Just thank you, Ivan, for the comment, and I'll think about it. I think probably there's nothing I can do about it in this framework, even if it's important, which it probably is. Thanks.
Okay, so David, you have one very short question also.
Yeah,
Please
so
unmute yourself.
a question for Ron and Andy, and it has to do with capital intensification or capital deepening. And you know, one thing that is worrying me, and maybe I shouldn't be worried, is that what we're seeing, firstly as a result of the financial crisis, and secondly as a result of COVID-19, is that government borrowing is going up a lot. So in a world where everyone's a life cycle saver and they're saving money, the implication of that would be that rather than saving money in the form of creating investment, they're saving money in the form of lending to governments who are then basically spending the money. How do we account for that in the kinds of models that you were presenting? And I mean, is it an important issue?
Let me go first so that Andy will have time to think of a really good answer. Because yeah, that's a big problem. I mean, I also think of, I said, well, capital and assets are the same thing. You're saying, no, they're not. You're right, of course. I have tried looking at housing, separating housing and I don't know what you call it, material, what physical capital or something. That didn't really make any difference, because what matters in the model I'm using is the proportional changes, and as long as the mix stays about the same, it doesn't matter. But you're saying the mix is going to change, And I don't have any answer to that. That's your point. Thank you. But Andy will set us straight. Right, Andy?
So in my simple model, it's irrelevant. Well, yeah, we worry about, in general, when we use more complicated models. So yeah, does public debt crowd out private capital? I mean, that's the basic question, I think. And it's an important one. And I don't really know what more to say about it. Ron, your answer was just brilliant, I thought.
So thank you very much. So I'm now going to close the session. So I want to thank again the organizer, the presenter, and all of you for your attention and these interesting questions. This was really a great session.